Our goal is to have kids who know how to make wise decisions. Even better if they learn how to make wise decisions now and carry that skill far into adulthood. The problem is that the best way to learn how to make decisions is through life experiences, by making mistakes, by recovering. And it also takes time to have a series of life experiences until you get wiser and wiser and wiser. So we want to rush the process a bit. So what do we tend to do as adults? We tend to tell them what to do. And we tend to do that through a lecture. Problem is that backfires. What I want to do is offer you a communication strategy that isn't going to backfire. Why? Because it's going to help kids learn to own their own solutions, to be able to make their own decisions. And when they do, there's nothing to rebel against because it's their ideas. To understand how this model works, you have to really begin by understanding how kids think. So first, let's be a child. I'm 5 years old. How do I think? I am an egocentric thinker, meaning the world revolves around me. Second, I can't think about the future. I'm completely living in the present. If I hand my 5-year-old $1.25 and say, go get yourself a giant candy bar, but I strongly suggest investment, that kid's getting the candy. Why? Because it's here and now. And how do I view people? I view people by what they do for me. Hey, is that cookie for me? This is called concrete thinking. Why concrete? Because it's like a rock. You don't see beyond it. It is exactly what it looks like. You break it in half, it's 2 rocks. The problem with concrete thinking is that it can set you up for danger because you're not planning into the future and you're not understanding the complexity of human beings. So what do we do to protect our children? We watch them very closely. Now I'm walking through adolescence, where you should be watching me closer than ever, but you're probably not. Here I am as an adult. How do I think as an adult? I can think into the future. I can understand how smoking cigarettes now is going to affect my health later. And I also understand human complexity. Suppose someone comes up to me and they're incredibly flattering, they're incredibly generous, and then they try to manipulate me or take advantage of me. I understand why they were flattering and why they were generous, and that is highly protective for me. That is called abstract thought. Here's what you need to know about abstract thought. Number one, not everybody gets there. All right? About 10% of people, somewhat related to intelligence, never get there. Number two, all people in times of crisis go backwards and can only think concretely. All people. And when you yell at your child or make them ashamed of something, it puts them in crisis. So even the brightest kid suddenly can't think of themselves out of a paper box when they know that you're really angry or disappointed in them. Number three, it's a developmental process. So the child begins by thinking concretely. Then some hormones begin to go through their body, their brain changes, and they're able to absorb information differently so they can begin to have the capacity to think abstractly. What else happens during adolescence? It's not just your brain and your body changing, it's also you're having life experiences. So imagine that 14-year-old girl and a guy comes up to me and says, I love you, right? That girl doesn't go, I question the truthfulness of that statement. She says, oh, I love you too. And then he hurts her. And she doesn't fall for that line again. And she moves a small step of the way towards the journey of having abstract thought and understanding that people can be flattering but manipulative. So there's no better way to learn, right? If we were learning theorists, we would say, get out of the way, let kids make lots of mistakes. But we're not. We're mommies and daddies, and I'm a doctor, and my job is to protect kids. Our job is to protect our kids. So what do? We know the complexity of human nature. We know that what we do can affect the future, so we share it with our kids very quickly. And here's what a lecture sounds like. Don't you know that what you're doing right now, which I'm going to call behavior A, could easily lead to consequence B? I never imagined my little girl doing consequence B, but now I wonder what's between ears besides cobwebs. If consequence B happens, you're more than likely to go on a consequence C, which is a slippery slope to consequence D. You never would have even considered consequence D, young lady, if you didn't begin hanging out with Peter, whose own mother doesn't like him. If consequence D happens, you're more than likely to go on a consequence E, which is a slippery slope to consequence F. Look at me, young lady, when I'm talking to you, because this isn't for my own good. If consequence F happens, you're more than likely to go on to consequence G, which more than often leads to consequence H, which could, God forbid, lead to consequence I. And do you know what happens if consequence I happens? You die is what happens. And what does she hear? Womp, 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 womp. Die. She gets all of your condescension, all of your anger. She feels powerless, but she didn't understand your message at all. Why? Let's look at the mathematical structure of the lecture. A goes to B, which goes to C. There are all sorts of mysterious intervening variables that will lead to the ultimate outcome. That's algebra. When do we teach kids algebra? Our brightest kids get it in 8th grade. Many kids don't get it till 9th, 10th, or 11th grade. Why? Because it is abstract math. The brain cannot think abstractly until a certain point in development. And even if you're there, but you're frustrated or angry or scared or running from the tiger, you can't think abstractly. So when we speak to kids with an algebraic structure to our communication style, they understand our anger, they understand our condescension, but they don't understand a word that we say. They feel powerless. They want to rebel to prove us wrong. There's a better way. It's about changing the mathematical structure of how you talk. It's as simple as beginning to talk to a kid using 3rd grade math, but not condescending, not in a way that sounds like you're talking down, but in a way that honors their intelligence. The other thing is we've got to back up and understand that we have to approach this with radical calmness. So when you want your child to learn a lesson, you don't do it when you're angry or disappointed, because you're going to make them run from the tiger, because you're running yourself. So you give yourself a timeout, and then you approach it when you're radically calm. And how are you going to talk now? 3rd grade math. 1 + 1 = 2. And when there are 2 and only when there are 2, do you add another 1? And when there are 3 and only when there are 3, do you add another 4 to make them understand 7? So what does this look like? Darling, I understand that you're doing behavior A, but I want you to understand why I'm worried about it. Sometimes that can lead to consequence B, and I hate the idea of that happening to you. What do you have in mind to make sure that B doesn't happen, to make sure you're protecting yourself? And now what do? You listen, you draw out, you facilitate, you congratulate. If they haven't come up with an idea, you say, hey, I have one too. May I make a suggestion? And when they're at B, and only when they're at B, do you take them to C? And when they're at C, and only when they're at C, do you take them to D? That might be a minute later, it might be the next car ride, or it might be the next week. So even though it'll be frustrating you to be moving slower, what you're doing is you're giving your kid power to figure things out, to make their own decisions, and to own the solutions. And when they do, they have no one to rebel against, because they own the solutions, and you have trusted that your child is ultimately the expert in his or her own life. The secret to rebellion prevention is wisely guiding our kids to take control of their own decisions.